John lived in a small town called Greenfield. It was a quiet place. The people were friendly. John was a quiet man. He did not have many friends, but he was happy. Every day, John went to work at a bookstore. The bookstore was small, but it had many books. John loved books very much. He liked to read about faraway places, like big cities, sunny beaches, and tall mountains. When John was in the bookstore, he liked to dream. He dreamed about the places he read about. He dreamed about walking in a big city, feeling the warm sun on a beach, or climbing a tall mountain. John had one big wish. He wanted to see the mountains. He wanted to see the snow on the tall mountains. He wanted to feel the cold air on his face. But John never went. Every year, he found a reason not to go. He said, "I do not have enough money, or am too busy at work." But really, John was afraid to go alone. John also worried about other things. What if he got lost? What if something bad happened far from home? These thoughts made him stay in Greenfield. Greenfield was safe and familiar. But John still wanted to see the mountains. He could not forget about them. One morning, John woke up. He looked at the calendar. It was his birthday. He was 35 years old. John sat on his bed and thought. He thought about his life in Greenfield. He thought about the mountains and the cold air. He thought about how he had waited many years. "I am getting older," John thought. "I have waited too long. I need to see the mountains." John decided to go. "I will go," John said. "Nothing will stop me." He felt scared, but he also felt excited. He had never traveled far from home. Greenfield was the only place he knew. But he knew he had to go. He had to see the mountains. "I can do this," John said. He felt a little stronger. The decision made him feel brave. The next day, John got ready for his trip. He was a little nervous, but he was also excited. He knew this trip was important to him. John went to his closet. He opened the door and looked inside. His closet was small. Inside, he saw his old suitcase. The suitcase was on the top shelf. It was covered in dust because John had not used it for many years. John took the suitcase down and cleaned it. He opened it and looked inside. The suitcase was empty, but it reminded John of the few trips he had taken long ago. He smiled a little, remembering those trips. But this trip was different. This trip was special. John was going to the mountains. John started to pack his suitcase. First, he packed warm clothes. He packed a thick sweater, a warm jacket, and heavy socks. He knew the mountains would be cold, so he wanted to be prepared. Then, he packed his favorite book. This book was very special to John. He had read it many times, and it always made him feel calm and happy. Next, John packed a small notebook. John liked to write. He often wrote about his thoughts and dreams. He wanted to write about his trip to the mountains. He wanted to remember every detail, so he packed the notebook and a pen. After packing his suitcase, John went to the bookstore where he worked. The bookstore was quiet in the morning. John walked around, looking for things he might need on his trip. He found a map of the mountains. The map showed the paths and trails in the mountains. John thought it would be very useful, so he bought it. Then, John saw a small book with advice on where to go and what to do in the mountains. The book had many tips for travelers. It told where to find the best views, how to stay safe, and what to bring. John thought this book would help him a lot, so he bought it too. As the day of the trip got closer, John felt more nervous. He had never traveled alone before. He started to worry. He worried about getting lost in the mountains. He worried about being alone far from home. But every time he felt scared, he thought about his dream. He thought about the tall mountains and the snow. He thought about how long he had waited to see them. I have waited so long, John said to himself. I need to see the mountains. This thought made him feel a little braver. He knew he had to go, even if he was afraid. John decided to tell his friends about his trip. He wanted to share his plans with them. One day, he met his friend Sarah at the bookstore. John told Sarah about his trip to the mountains. Sarah was surprised. Are you really going? She asked. John nodded. Yes, he said. I have to go. I have dreamed about this for many years. Sarah smiled at John. You will love it, she said. The mountains are very beautiful. You will have a good time. Her words made John feel better. He was still a little scared, but now he was also excited. He was looking forward to the trip. Finally, the day came. It was the day John would leave for the mountains. John woke up early. He made sure everything was ready. He double-checked his suitcase to make sure he had everything he needed. Then, he walked to the train station. John felt a little scared and a little excited. He was leaving his town, his home, and everything familiar. But he was also starting a new adventure. He was going to see the mountains. He was going to make his dream come true. As John waited for the train, he took a deep breath. He looked around at the town he had always known. It was a small town, but it was his home. John knew he would miss it, but he also knew it was time for a change. It was time to see something new. When the train arrived, John picked up his suitcase and got on the train. He found a seat by the window. As the train started to move, John looked out the window. He watched as his town slowly disappeared in the distance. John felt a mix of emotions: sadness, excitement, fear, and hope. But most of all, he felt ready. He was ready for his adventure. He was ready to see the mountains. The train ride was long. He watched the world outside. At first, he saw the fields and houses of Greenfield. But soon, the fields turned into forests. The trees were tall and green. The train went higher, and John saw the mountains far away. The mountains were tall and white with snow. They were more beautiful than John had ever imagined. He felt very happy. I am really going to see the mountains, John thought. This is my wish. As the train got closer, John saw small villages. The houses were made of wood. People walked in the streets. Everything was peaceful. John felt calm. He was far from Greenfield, but he felt good. The train stopped at a small station. John got off the train. The air was cold. It felt fresh. He took a deep breath. He smiled. The mountain air was different from the air in Greenfield. It was clean. John picked up his suitcase. He walked to the village where he would stay. The village was small and quiet. The houses were made of wood. The streets were narrow. People in the village smiled at John as he walked by. He felt welcome. John found a small hotel. The owner of the hotel was an old man. He smiled at John. "Welcome," the man said. "I hope you like our village." John smiled back and thanked the man. His room was small, but it was nice. There was a window. John looked out the window. He could see the mountains. He felt happy. He was finally here. The next morning, John woke up early. He wanted to see the mountains. He put on his warm clothes. He packed a small bag with his map and his notebook. Then, he left the hotel and started walking. The trail to the mountains was outside the village. The trail went into a big forest. The trees were tall. The ground was covered with leaves. John walked slowly. He liked the quiet of the forest. As he walked, the ground went up. The trail was steep, but John did not mind. He liked walking. The air was cool and fresh. The forest was quiet. John could hear birds singing in the trees. After walking for a while, John reached a small clearing in the forest. From there, he could see the mountains. The mountains were very high. The view was amazing. John stopped. He took out his notebook. He wanted to write down what he saw. "The mountains are very beautiful," he wrote. "I am happy I came." John continued walking. He found a small stream. The water was clear and cold. John knelt down and drank the water. It was very fresh. He sat by the stream for a while. He listened to the sound of the water. After resting, John got up. He continued walking. The trail led him to a high place. From there, he could see the valley below. The village looked very small. The mountains were all around him. John felt very peaceful. "This is why I came," he thought. "This is my wish." As John stood on the high place, he heard a noise. He turned around. He saw a small dog on the trail. The dog had white fur and blue eyes. It wagged its tail. The dog looked at John. John smiled and said, "Hello, little dog. Where did you come from?" The dog barked and ran to John. John knelt down and petted the dog. The dog licked John's hand. It wagged its tail again. The dog was friendly. "Do you want to walk with me?" John asked. The dog barked again. It ran ahead on the trail. John laughed. "I think that means yes," he said. The dog led John down the trail. The dog seemed to know the way. John followed the dog. The dog jumped over rocks and ran through the forest. John tried to keep up. The dog led John to a small lake in the forest. The water was clear. The trees around the lake were tall. The lake was very quiet. John was surprised. "This place is very beautiful," he said. "Thank you for bringing me here." The dog barked and wagged its tail. It was happy. John sat by the water. He took out his notebook. He wrote about the lake. He wrote about how peaceful it was. The dog lay down next to John. It rested its head on its paws. John spent the afternoon by the lake. He enjoyed the quiet. The dog stayed with him. John felt very happy. He was far from home, but he felt at home in the mountains. He was glad he came. The sun began to set. John knew it was time to go back to the village. He stood up and called the dog. "Come on, let's go home," he said. The dog barked and followed John. They walked back to the village together. When they reached the village, John looked at the dog and said, "Thank you for being my guide. You are a good friend." The dog wagged its tail and barked softly. John smiled. Then, he went back to his hotel. That night, John thought about the day. He felt happy. He made a new friend and found a beautiful place. He knew tomorrow would be another good day. The next morning, John woke up early. He wanted to see more of the mountains. He dressed warmly. He went outside. The dog was waiting for him by the door. John smiled. "Good morning, Snowy," he said. He decided to call the dog Snowy because of its white fur. Snowy barked and wagged its tail. John and Snowy started walking on a new trail. This trail was steep and rocky, but John did not mind. He followed Snowy up the trail. They climbed higher and higher. The air became colder. The trees became fewer. After a few hours, they reached the top of a hill. From there, John could see all the mountains. The peaks were white with snow. The valleys below were green with trees. It was the most beautiful view John had ever seen. He stood quietly, looking at the mountains. Snowy sat next to him, also looking at the mountains. John felt very peaceful. He was far from Greenfield. He was far from his work and his worries. Here in the mountains, he felt free. He took out his notebook and wrote about the view. "This is why I wanted to see the mountains," he wrote. "I feel very happy." John and Snowy spent the day exploring. They found more lakes and streams. They even saw deer in the forest. John was amazed by the beauty of the mountains. Every step showed him something new. As the day ended, John and Snowy went back to the village. They were tired but happy. John felt he had made the right choice to come to the mountains. He knew he would always remember this day. One day, Snowy led John down a trail that was not on the map. The trail was narrow. The trees were close together. It was dark and quiet. John wondered where Snowy was taking him. The trail led them deep into the forest. The trees were tall. The air was cool. John could hear water. He followed Snowy. After a long walk, the trail opened up. They were in a hidden valley. There was a large, clear lake in the middle. The water was still. The trees and mountains were reflected in the water like a mirror. The valley was very beautiful. John was amazed. He had never seen a place like this. "This is incredible," he said softly. "Thank you for bringing me here, Snowy." Snowy wagged its tail and barked happily. John sat by the lake. He took out his notebook and wrote about the valley. He wrote about the clear water and the tall trees. He wrote about how lucky he felt to be here. Snowy lay down next to him. It rested after the long walk. John stayed in the valley all day. He walked around the lake. He explored the forest. He even put his feet in the cool water. It was a perfect day. John knew he would always remember this place. The sun began to set. John knew it was time to go back to the village. He called Snowy. They began the walk back. The trail was dark, but Snowy led the way. John felt safe with Snowy by his side. When they reached the village, it was dark. The stars were shining. John looked up at the stars and smiled. He felt very happy. He knew this trip was special. 2 weeks later, it was time for John to go home. He packed his suitcase. He felt a little sad. He knew he would miss the mountains. He would miss the village. He would miss Snowy. But he also knew it was time to go back to Greenfield. On the morning of his departure, Snowy was waiting for him. John knelt down and petted Snowy. "Thank you, Snowy," he said softly. "You are a good friend. I will never forget you." Snowy wagged its tail and licked John's hand. The dog seemed to understand. It did not look sad. Instead, Snowy looked up at John. The dog's eyes seemed to say, "It's okay. You can come back." John smiled and hugged Snowy. Then, he picked up his suitcase. He waved goodbye to the hotel owner. He walked to the train station. Snowy followed him. The dog watched as John got on the train. As the train left, John looked out the window. He saw Snowy standing on the platform. Snowy watched him go. John felt a lump in his throat, but he also felt happy. The mountains had given him so much. He saw the beauty of nature. He felt the joy of adventure. He learned to live in the moment. And Snowy had taught him the value of friendship. When John returned to Greenfield, everything looked the same. But John felt different. He was not afraid anymore. He knew the world was full of beautiful places. He wanted to see them all. He started to plan more trips. He was ready for more adventures. John's friends noticed the change in him. "You seem happier, John," Sarah said. "What happened in the mountains?" John smiled and said, "I found something I didn't know I was looking for. I learned that life is about more than work and staying safe. It's about seeing new places and making good memories." John continued to travel. He kept the memory of the mountains and Snowy close to his heart. He knew that he had found something special, a life full of happiness and peace.